So Social Security can be defined as a system of benefits put in place by a government of a country and its private sector in order to provide financial protection against contingent life events. Now, it's something that affects us all, professionally in terms of the risk and savings products that we look after, but also personally as contributors to and beneficiaries of the system. That said, despite its importance, it's a topic that gets very little airtime in terms of actuarial training. So our presentation to you today is one by actuaries for actuaries on Social Security to firstly explain the context in which Social Security is provided in our country, then to explain the nuts and bolts of how our Social Security system works, its strengths and weaknesses, as well as some of the proposals that are on the table currently. We'll then take you through some of the things that we've been doing in order to be involved as actuaries in the process of Social Security reform. So you're probably aware that we live in one of the most unequal countries in the world. In fact, if we were to shrink our population of 60 million people down to just 10 households, the picture would look something like this. 2 in 10 of those households would be below the food poverty line. This means they have a per capita income level that is inadequate to feed an adult a nutritionally balanced diet for a month. A further 2 households would be above that food poverty line measure, but still considered to be living in poverty because they would be below our broadest definition of poverty. This income disparity has massive implications for tax revenue collection. Only 2 in 10 households have people in it who are registered for personal income tax. And those same 2 households contribute over 70% of the country's VAT revenues. Now VAT, personal income tax, and corporate tax make up 84% of government's revenues. A major reason for this poverty and inequality is the fact that so many South Africans of working age are not actually working. We do have a fairly large economically inactive portion, which includes caregivers of young children, people who are age 15 and up who are still in training, and people aged between 60 and 65 who are retired, because the working age population is counted from age 50 to 64. However, only 4 in 10 South Africans aged between 15 and 64 are actually working, and of those, 3 are in the formal sector, and 1 is self-employed or in the informal sector. As dire as this picture looks, there are numerous studies to show it would be profoundly worse without our relatively well-developed social security system, which we can divide into 4 tiers. So the first is social assistance, otherwise known as grants. These are mandatory benefits. You can't opt out of contributing to them. But they're called non-contributory, which doesn't mean they're free. Nothing's free. They're funded from general tax revenue. But you never have to pay anything into that system in order to get something out. Then we move on to Tier 2. Tier 2 is also known as social insurance. These are mandatory arrangements. You don't have a choice or not as to whether to join them, but you have to contribute into them in order to get something out. Usually, social insurance schemes are quite redistributive, so what you put in might not be a great indication of what you're going to get out. There are often large transfers from high-income earners to low-income earners. Then we have Tier 3, which is starting to be more familiar to us actuaries. These are your supplementary employer arrangements or employee benefits. Whether or not they're mandatory is an interesting conversation, which ANDREA will come back to later, but they're contributory and there is quite a bit of cross-subsidy, less than in Tier 2 though. Then you have Tier 4. These are your discretionary arrangements. They're voluntary and contributory, and these are your retail arrangements. Now, Tier 1, the state is very involved there, and there's relatively little private sector involvement, and it reverses as you move through the tiers to Tier 4. So we're going to start off looking at Tier 1. So there are 9 grants available on Tier 1. So the CSG, Child Support Grant, Care Dependency Grant, CDG, and Foster Child Grant all relate to children under the age of 18. The Care Dependency Grant is for carers of disabled children who, in theory, at age 18, should be able to switch over to the Disability Grant. However, there are qualification differences between the two grants which can result in some gaps in coverage. In terms of grants for adults, other grants for adults, we have the Social Relief of Distress Grant, or SRD, which contrary to popular belief we had long before COVID. This is an emergency grant that government is able to use to provide benefits in cash or kind before other grants kick in. So for example, if there was a shack fire in a community, the government could then go in and give benefits in terms of food as well as in cash. They're temporary grants valid for a maximum of 3 months. The COVID-19 SRD was a special class of this grant introduced at the start of the first hard lockdown and was intended for unemployed adults aged 18 to 59, not on UIF or any other grants. It was intended to be a temporary grant, but when it was removed in April 2021, the backlash was so severe that it had to be reinstated in August 2021. And lots of people view it as a de facto permanent grant. In terms of grants familiar to us in terms of retirement, we have the old age grant paid for persons over the age of 60. We also have a war veterans grant. Now there are fewer than 20 war veterans left, and for all intents and purposes, it's the same as the old age grant. If you are a recipient of a disability grant, an old age grant, or a war veterans grant, and you need someone to help take care of you, you can apply for what's called the grant in aid on top of these benefits. Our grants are largely means tested. A strange exception is the foster child grant, which isn't. And these means tests mean that you have to earn below a certain income level in order to get these grants, or in some cases also have below a certain threshold level of assets. How the means tests are applied, in some cases it's an all or nothing system. Either you get the grant in full or you don't get it at all, whereas in other cases it's on a sliding scale basis. So earlier we spoke about dividing our population up into 10 households, and if we arrange those 10 households by income, from poorest to richest, we would have something like what's up on the screen now. And what's interesting is the poorest 3 households get more than 50% of their income from grants. As income increases, reliance on grants tends to decrease. I do find it very interesting that there's still people in decile 9 households who are receiving grants despite the means test. There is a little bit of a blip around deciles 5 and 6, and that's because there are a lot more old people in decile 6 households than other households, and because of the relative size of the grants, which is what we'll get to now. So up on the screen, you have that food poverty line. That's our narrowest definition of poverty. This is the 2022 level, but it illustrates the point. And then we have the upper bound poverty line. This is our broadest definition of poverty and takes account of needs other than food. And there we have the grants. So the 2 grants that are most taken up, the COVID-19 SRD and the Child Support Grant, are both well below that food poverty line. The foster child grant is between the 2 poverty lines, and the other grants are actually well above. Now, there is a top-up benefit, a 50% top-up available on the CSG, the Child Support Grant, if you can prove you're a double orphan, which does help move that grant level above the food poverty line, because of course, as any parent can tell you, a child can eat as much or more than an adult. There is also a 20 Rand top-up on the old age grant available for people over the age of 75. And then, of course, you can get your grant and aid on top of some of the grants, but those grants are already well above the poverty line level. So in terms of government expenditure, Tier 1 is very big. In fact, the Department of Social Development has the biggest government budget. We spend more on grants, or about as much on grants, as we do on health care. 4.4% of government's budget alone is spent on that old age grant. And this is only going to get worse as our population ages. So that's Tier 1, social assistance. Moving on to Tier 2. So Tier 1 benefits are all fall under the Department of Social Development and are all paid for by the South African Social Security Agency, or SASSA. Tier 2, you will notice that Department of Social Development is conspicuous by its absence, and none of these grants are paid by SASSA. The Department of Transport takes care of the Road Accident Fund, or RAF. The Unemployment Insurance Fund has benefits taken care of by the Department of Employment and Labour, but contributions set and taken care of by National Treasury. COIDA, which is the Compensation for Occupational Injuries and Diseases Act, is run by the Department of Employment and Labour, who runs the compensation fund, but there are also two devolved insurers that run alongside the compensation fund. And then you have the Occupational Diseases and Mines and Works Act, which is run by the Department of Health as a result of a hospital pass back in the 1980s. In terms of the benefit events that are covered, RAF covers you in terms of a motor vehicle accident. The UIF covers you for unemployment or underemployment due to things from retrenchments, dismissals, end of contracts, or simply your employer cutting down on your number of shifts. They also pay death benefits as well as caring responsibilities, and that's a relatively complicated system. So COIDA covers absolutely everyone for their occupational injuries. However, if you happen to be a mine worker and you happen to develop an occupationally acquired lung disease that is on the ADIMWA list, then you have to claim through ADIMWA for that instead of COIDA. You may not claim through COIDA at all. If you're a factory worker who developed exactly the same lung disease, you claim through COIDA. So it's complicated. The claim mechanisms for UIF, COIDA, and ADIMWA are insurance-based and familiar to us. RAF, however, functions through the courts. And the benefits vary in terms of mixes of lump sums and income levels. And also what these benefits cover are different, and you can see some of the differences between the Tier 2 benefits up on the screen. Now, as pensions actuaries, a lot of us are familiar with the concept of a pensionable salary and the fact that the earnings which you contribute on don't necessarily reflect your full earnings. Now, social insurance has the same concept, and those are called covered or insured earnings. And often these schemes have minimum and maximum levels in order to give that redistribution that you would normally expect to see in social insurance. So if we look at COIDA, for example, it has a minimum earnings level. Now, if you earn less than that minimum's earning level and you become occupationally injured, you are deemed to earn at that minimum level for the calculation of your benefit. It also has a maximum level, and you can see that it's updated fairly frequently. ADIMWA's maximum insured earnings level falls below the minimum for COIDA and is very rarely updated. And in fact, based on Minerals Council statistics, it's so low relative to the average mine worker's salary that this is essentially a flat rate benefit now. The UIF changes the insured earnings on a fairly infrequent basis. Now, RAF, because it has to be different, doesn't work on an insured earnings basis. What RAF does is it caps your loss. So let's say you're an actuary and you're earning R1.5 million a year, and you're involved in a motor vehicle accident and you can no longer work. RAF will pay you a maximum of R300,000 per annum as compensation for your loss of earnings. Depending on when your accident was, that figure changes. So RAF caps your loss instead, and you can see that the capped amount for RAF is a bit less than what COIDA would give you. So that's Tier 2 with all its complexity. I'm now going to hand over to Andrea to talk to you about Tiers 3 and 4.
Thanks, Megan. Whenever I listen to you, I am always surprised, by how little I knew about these first 3 tiers and how much you know about it. And I'm glad I get to talk to the audience about Tier 3 and 4, which I think for most of us in the room is something that we are a little bit more familiar with in terms of how they work. So Tier 3 is our supplementary employer arrangements or our retirement schemes. So most large employers or employers of decent size in South Africa offer a retirement benefit to their employees through participation in either a pension and provident fund, which they then do either on a standalone basis or in an umbrella fund, which could be at an industry level or as part of a commercial umbrella fund. Now, these arrangements are offered by employers for their employees with the understanding that this is something beneficial to help them save for retirement, because in all likelihood the old age pension grant is not going to be sufficient for many employees to replace their income in retirement. However, these schemes are not mandatory per such, so there's nothing in legislation currently that forces an employer to have such a scheme. However, if it is offered by that employer, it is compulsory for all employees, fixed-term employees of that employer, to then belong to the scheme. And I think for this reason, this is why these schemes are, by and large, by many members, thought to be compulsory arrangements. It is because the individuals, if their employer offers them, they don't have the option to opt out of these schemes. It is a condition of employment. To encourage people to participate in the scheme, there are some tax incentives for participation. So we all know there is a tax deduction on contributions made into these schemes up to 27.5% of your income, capped at $350 per annum, and that your growth in these schemes are also not taxed. There is no tax on investment income, and you also don't pay dividend tax or capital gains tax on your growth. However, at the point when you retire and you then either take a lump sum or convert your income into your lump sum into income in retirement, tax applies at that point in terms of the income drawdown that you then have. So this system is basically set up on what we call an EET basis or an exempt tax basis. Key for these arrangements to work is this employer-employee relationship that's necessary, as well as the rules and the regular nature of the rules to which people contribute into these schemes. So they don't lend themselves naturally for people that have flexing contribution structures or lumpy contribution structures, and the rules make them that they don't necessarily fit for everyone that wants to participate in such a scheme. To the extent that these schemes are offered, the benefits are usually two-tiered. They offer both a savings component in terms of your retirement benefit savings, but then most of them also offer some form of group insurance, predominantly life and disability insurance, but many employers have also added on critical illness and funeral arrangements for their staff members participating in the schemes. So again, to the extent that there is a group insurance component to this, it will be compulsory for all of the employees to participate in it. Because of this compulsory nature, it often makes these schemes more cost-effective for members. However, I do think in our post-COVID world, a lot of that has changed, and the pricing of group schemes is something that I know the industry is currently looking at and considering, because the premium increases through the COVID period have made the schemes potentially more expensive for people. And when we look at some of the kind of complexities of the system, I think that affordability issue and the increase in premiums is something that we will cover. Coverage in terms of this sector is actually quite large, in that currently we have about 1,700 active funds. This is of the FSCA database, covering about 12 million members with 2.4 trillion in assets under management. That being said, that we do understand that, if you look at these 12 million members being covered, that is member records, it's not necessarily individuals. So to the extent that people, for example, participate in pension, provident hybrids, it might be some duplication in the numbers. But in terms of formal sector coverage, they actually do cover quite a large portion of the formal sector. Tier 4 arrangements are then the discretionary arrangement or the arrangements for the individuals. So these would be retail arrangements in the form of RAs, life insurance, short-term insurance, and discretionary investments, where predominantly the individual opts to take out cover. Now, this could be self-employed individuals, individuals working for employers that don't offer a form of a group benefit, or top-ups to occupational schemes for these individuals. The characteristics of the products offered in this tier is that they are typically, it is the individual. There is no employer relationship typically involved in them, although we do see some group RA arrangements coming into the market of late. They are voluntary. They are flexible. So if you think about new age retirement annuities, there's a lot more flexibility for the individuals in terms of contribution payments, lump sum, recurring, stop-start contributions, for example. Often they do come with higher costs because of limited pooling, and in this tier specifically, I think many of the products here it's that market where the products are bought, not sold, not bought, in that brokers are involved, and they are typically very active in this market to get people to purchase these products, and it's typically associated with that broker involvement in the product. So now that we've kind of taken a look at what the system looks like, I think the next step of our presentation, and I'll first hand back to Megan before I end off with tier 3 and 4 again, is to just then understand what is working and what is not working in this system.
So in terms of Tier 1, it's widely acknowledged that we have good coverage, and but what we mean by that is people who are entitled to receive the grants, by and large, get them, barring some operational issues. However, and depending on how many people are claiming their COVID-19 SRD grant, we have between 40 and 47% of the population in receipt of a grant in any month. So that's a fairly high coverage percentage, which we need to also consider against our relatively narrow tax base. And that dependency ratio of the number of people who are supported by each taxpayer is something that we needs to be closely monitored, particularly as our population ages, particularly given the size of the old age grant. Now, I know it feels almost intuitive that if someone receives a grant, they won't necessarily go out and look for a job. But there's abundant research to show that in the South African environment, households in receipt of grants are more likely to go out and seek employment than equivalent households not in receipt of grants. And this is because it allows them a little bit of breathing room to find taxi fare to go out and look for work, arrange childcare, etc. So we don't have a dependency culture problem in this country. One of the areas where we do have a problem, though, are the number of able-bodied unemployed adults. Now, in theory, social insurance and the Unemployment Insurance Fund should fix that, but it only fixes it if you've ever worked before. And we have a huge youth unemployment problem. And what do we do with the unemployed youth? Do we cater for them via a grant or something in the grant system, or do we cater for them some other way? And that's a question that still needs to be addressed. The means tests are controversial. In 2002, the Taylor Commission recommended that the means tests be abolished. We still have them, and Stephen will talk to that issue a bit later. The final point is the distinction between the child support grant and the foster child grant. Now, in reality, the difference between a double orphan on the CSG and a child on the FCG is the fact that in the latter case, the guardians had access to the court system. Otherwise, you have identical children receiving different benefits simply by virtue of the fact of access to courts and legal advice. So the distinction between the two of them is very controversial. The FCG has been decreasing in real terms over a number of years, but there's still a fairly wide gap between the two. In terms of Tier 2, the only nice thing I could find to say was that it was established. In terms of what needs work, we can start off by looking at the Road Accident Fund, or RAF. Now, RAF's deficit is about 100 billion rand. It's one of the biggest liabilities on government's balance sheet. And one of the reasons for that is because of where we got RAF from. So from 1943 to 1986, we had compulsory third-party motor insurance in this country. However, by the 1980s, it was so clear that compliance was really poor that they decided to throw that whole system out, create a levy on petrol and diesel that everyone would have to pay for because they had to buy petrol. And then if there was a car accident and someone was at fault, you didn't sue the driver at fault, you sued the Road Accident Fund instead. Now, back in 1986, all of our heavy freight was being taken by rail, and so we didn't have nearly as many trucks on the road. So the driving conditions on the roads were different, the quality of the roads were different. Also, we didn't have cars that didn't need petrol or diesel. So with the transition to electric vehicles, we're also going to have more vehicles on the road who are not contributing to the Road Accident Fund. So there are a number of problems with the system that we have. A further issue is that RAF limits your common law right to sue. So remember earlier I gave you that example, you're the actuary earning 1.5 million, you can get 300,000 rand from RAF, and you cannot sue anyone else for the remaining 1.2 million. If you didn't have Tier 4 or Tier 3 insurance for that, sorry for you. So that removal of your common law right to sue has been a very big stumbling block in terms of any proposed reforms to RAF. It's also interesting to note that what constitutes a RAF claim and what doesn't can be relatively arbitrary. If you are hit by an out-of-control golf cart or an out-of-control tuk-tuk, the processes for your claims are different. One is covered by RAF and one isn't. So one of the other problems with RAF is the process. It's extremely time consuming. Even with a well-managed court roll, you're looking at about a 5-year delay before getting any money out the system. You also have to go through an attorney, and there's no legal aid available to create a RAF claim. So to put this in context, the average RAF benefit in 2020 was 138,000 Rand. In terms of costs, it costs RAF about 38,000 Rand to settle that. That's including their own legal fees. But on top of that, they're then paying 178,000 Rand towards the claimant's legal fees. In other words, RAF is paying more in legal fees than they are actually paying in benefits. So there's a lot that needs to change in terms of the Road Accident Fund. In terms of COIDA and ADIMWA, the distinction between the two has been controversial for a very long time. And it was agreed that it would be ideal for these two pieces of legislation to be merged into one act for occupational health and safety, but there hasn't been much progress in that area either. The Unemployment Insurance Fund has been in the news recently in terms of its administrative capacity, because even though you and I and 10 million other South Africans contribute to the UIF on a monthly basis, the UIF has no record of your contributions into it until the time when you come to claim. Then you will have to present proof of all the contributions you've made to date, and only then will they calculate the benefit that is due. So actuarially, that must be a fascinating fund to value, but the administrative capacity of the UIF is problematic, with the result that at the moment reports on the ground are suggesting that most people are only getting the UIF benefit once their 1-year UIF benefit term is up. Also, because the admin is poor, there's no means of triggering a claim. So if I don't pay my UIF contribution, UIF doesn't know if I'm unemployed, if I just forgot, or if I'm dead, which is why you only get about 15,000 death claims a year coming through the UIF out of a covered population of about 10 million people. So that's one of the reasons why the UIF has a large surplus. But all in all, Tier 2 is extremely complex. We haven't actually scratched the surface in terms of the complexity of some of these benefits. They don't talk to each other within Tier 2. They don't talk to the benefits on any other tier. And if you consider the fact that most of them are there for cases where you don't have an employer anymore to guide you through the process, it's extremely daunting for anyone to use, with the result that you have missed benefit opportunities, so people who are entitled to benefits who never claim them, like their UIF death benefit, as well as potentially claiming for the same event from more than one fund. For example, COIDA, the RAF, and UIF, a process called double dipping. I'm now going to hand over to Andrea to take you through what's working and what's not with the other two tiers.
Thanks so much. And I think speaking about Tier 3 and 4, and again, as someone that works in this space, I do have a little bit of personal bias, and that I would like to say there's more going for it than just to say that it is established. And I think all of us in this room is putting a lot of effort into making this system better. But I think we have to acknowledge what is working, and also appreciate that there are some definite problems with what we have in terms of the Tier 3 and Tier 4 arrangements. So, looking at the positive side, it is an established system, and for those that are in the system, the 60% of the formerly employed that are in the system, it works generally quite well. There is a very good legal framework in terms of the PFA, in terms of conduct standards, in terms of regulation that apply to these funds, to make sure that they operate appropriately and that they offer benefits and protection to the people that are in it. In terms of your distribution of death claims, for example, in terms of your inability to access the funds unless there's specific circumstances in terms of 37D of the Pension Funds Act, and that it's protected from creditors, affords a lot of protection for people. To the extent that they have disputes, there's the PFA, there are regulatory bodies that they can go to. Even in the insurance space, you've got your ombud. People aren't necessarily required to go to the courts as their first avenue of resolving a dispute. Our administration systems in this system are generally working quite well, I think relative to, as Megan alluded to, in some of the Tier 2 arrangements that they have. We can offer some functionality to help members make their benefits work. There are, for example, life stage structures that operate in administration systems, daily unitizations. Systems are subject to audits, frequent checks, and balances to make sure that they are accurate and that they are verifiable in terms of working and providing benefits for people in it. In terms of some of the concerns with this sector, however, is that it does not cover everyone. And in the informal space, only about 12% of people participate in these types of arrangements. And even to the extent that they do then participate in these arrangements, we heard the comment recently at our social Indaba debate, which Stephen will talk to a bit later, of someone in this sector saying that they really feel like a square peg trying to fit into a round hole. The nature of their job, the nature of their remuneration, and how they get paid doesn't lend itself naturally to purchase and allow them to access many of these vehicles in this kind of insurance space and retirement savings space. Even though we've got these good regulatory frameworks and protection mechanisms, we have to acknowledge that they are not always enforced. And where there is failure on one party, it creates this question mark about the integrity of the system as a whole. So if one were to think, for as an example, the contravention where employers are deducting contributions from member salaries but not paying over into funds. In terms of a legislative framework, that shouldn't happen, and they should be reported, and it is a criminal offence that needs to be prosecuted. In practice, we don't always see this happening, although there has been positive steps, and I know the FSCA are also working towards trying different avenues to get people to comply and enforcing the governance on these kind of compliance rules with our sector. In terms of the cost and the balance, and I spoke about this a little bit earlier, in terms of, in this sector, what often happens is people contribute a single contribution to a fund, and that then needs to be split between savings and insurance. And so you have to balance the needs and the affordability aspects to make sure that you are providing adequate benefits on both fronts. So, to the extent that you don't need insurance, obviously you would want more savings towards retirement, but in the event of something happens, you need that insurance sector side as well. So just that balancing act that needs to happen to make sure that the benefits remain reasonable on both ends aren't necessarily always easy, and people don't always necessarily have the option to opt out of this and make decisions in their personal capacity suited to their specific needs. So it is a bit of a one-size-fits-all approach. We are trying to communicate with members, but I think most of us can acknowledge that we're not always successful in our communication efforts, and many people in this system don't necessarily understand it. Benefits can be complex. If you think about, for example, that the GPF also falls under this, it is a complex benefit system. It isn't necessarily easy for people to understand what their benefits are, and it's difficult for us to find the right avenues and mechanisms to communicate with people so that they appreciate and understand what benefits they have, what trade-offs they need to make, and what the implications of their decisions, and or good or bad, are on their outcomes at retirement. We know leakage is a problem to the extent that in the retirement space, when people change jobs currently in the employer-sponsored vehicles, they have that ability to cash in their savings. We know that the two-pot is on the table to address that, but to date, we've seen this lack of preservation having an impact on people achieving suitable outcomes at retirement. And to the extent that people are on a frequent basis taking these all of their cash out of the system, it is leading to a situation where people aren't contributing enough, they're not saving enough, and they're ending up with inadequate savings at retirement. If they manage to steer through all of that and they do end up with a decent pot of money at retirement, they also now have to convert this into an annuity. And as we've seen in the previous presentation, which I think was a very good piece of work, thank you ladies for that whilst I have the stage, but it isn't an easy decision for people to make. They need advice, and they need good and appropriate advice. It needs to be fit for purpose, and we know that people are buying inappropriate vehicles, and even to the extent that they are buying life annuities, there are some question marks around the fairness and the pricing as evidenced in the previous presentation. So now that we understand what the system looks like, what the pros and cons and what's working and not working of the system is, we will move on to consider how do our population then fit into this system and who is benefiting from what tiers. So for inspiration, I'm going to return to this slide of Megan's of our working age population in South Africa. What I do like about this slide is that it gives you an indication of the level of economic activity of the people in South Africa who are of working age. However, it doesn't tell you much else, and it leaves a lot up to your imagination. So any of these people could be at the start of their working life or at the end. They could be male, they could be female, they could be well-fed, they could be hungry. Some of them are semi-literate, some of them have postdoctoral degrees. There are optimists, there are pessimists, and there are everyone in between in this mix as well. It is also not a complete picture of our population. What we miss on screen here are people younger than 15, so our children, the youth, are not represented on this slide, and also people in retirement, by the definition being 65 years or older. So if we were to add them to this slide, and we have our, as we fondly refer to them, our jelly babies on screen, our population would be represented something like this. So how do these people then fit into the tiers? And now, spoiler alert, it's not great. Okay, so looking at tier 1, so as Megan mentioned, maybe let's say that it is important to understand that the tiers don't integrate very well. And if you look at who is benefiting from that becomes very apparent. So in tier 1, because of the means testing that we apply to our grants, it means that the majority of recipients and grant recipients are either economically inactive, discouraged work seekers, or unemployed. Given the childcare grant and the old age grant, we also typically see our green jelly babies and our grey jelly baby fitting into the tier 1 category as well. In terms of tier 2, it is very interesting. So the Road Accident Fund covers everyone. It is the only social benefit that extends to our entire population and tourists. So it in effect covers more than 100% of the population. In contrast, if we were to look at, say, for example, Udimwa, one has to consider that only 2.6% of the formerly employed are working in mining, right? So yet we have this Udimwa benefit that is payable for life. And even understandably that in the historical context, a lot more people were arguably employed in the mining sector, it still is only covering quite a small sector of our population. COIDA and UIF is a contributory in nature, so it means that you have to be formally employed, although granted there have been efforts to extend this to the informal sector, and I think most notably with the inclusion of domestic workers under the UIF, which make up about 26% of our informal sector. In terms of the unemployed that are benefiting from UIF, currently about 13% of our unemployed population are receiving some form of a UIF benefit. And then we know, I mean, we've spoken about the coverage in tier 3 and 4 as well, and arguably there is decent coverage there, but it is, relatively speaking, for a small portion of our population, and it is focused by and large in our formal employment sector. And very few of our informal workers operate in this space and have kind of benefits covered under tier 3 and 4. And also, if we think about it in terms of the effort being spent on this is where I think from an actuarial profession at least, the majority of our efforts, most of us work in the kind of schemes and products that are available for under tier 3 and 4. It's understandably so, given the 12 million membership as well as the asset base that is involved here, but we actually do see very limited involvement from actuaries in tier 1 and tier 2. Now, so I know, building off the optimism that Jeremy built this morning to say, you must be thinking now, but wait, I'm an actuary, maybe I can help, maybe there's something that I can do to get involved in tier 1 and tier 2 that desperately needs some actuarial input and actuarial resources, and we will get back to that. I think ending off this presentation, because how we see, us actually see being involved in these tiers and what we can do to help with the tiers. But before we go into that, I am going to hand over to Stephen, who's been sitting very patiently and very prettily on screen, to take us through what the International Labour Organization thinks our tiers should look like.
Thanks very much, Andrea, and hello to everybody. So where we got involved as a working group within the Actuarial Society was back in August 2021 when the Department of Social Development released a green paper on social security and retirement reform, their vision for social security reform especially. And the International Labour Organization's model is the most quoted model when it comes to, well, how do you assess pension systems in different countries? and what is the relative focus that should be placed, especially for different groups within the population. So when we, I'm going to speak about the Tier 1 proposals, and then Andrea is going to speak about Tier 2 proposals. The part that gets the blood boiling for us pensions actuaries is when you look at the size of Tier 2. So the ILO's model has got a universal pension in mind, which is not something that we have in South Africa yet. It's then got a very thick social insurance layer, so this National Social Security Fund concept, where 35 of the 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa already have these in place in terms of DB partially funded social security schemes. And then for us, that gives us great concern for those who depend on this for our living. The Tier 3, Tier 4 vision is actually relatively quite small. And that's the debate that we're getting involved with, that I'm going to speak about later. So currently, the section I'm covering is for NATALIE, so I hope I'm doing NATALIE justice, because NATALIE especially has a very huge interest and passion when it comes to the Tier 1 pensions, the grants. And so I must give the NATALIE quote that she always hits us with. So whenever we're talking about grants and we're saying, but can we afford to pay these grants, the question she always asks in response is, can we afford to not pay the grants, because they play such an important role. So the message also for us is that we will think about the pensions and benefits as these non-contributory versus contributory pensions, but there's actually a lot more that goes into a national social security framework that's there to care for people in a country. So it's not just about money directly, whether you've contributed to that money that you're going to get or not. It's also about the provision of food, the provision of education, the provision of healthcare, and even just something that, again, that NATALIE speaks about very passionately, is helping people get into a position where they can actually go out and seek employment. So it's easy for someone like myself to say the unemployed must just find employment, full stop. But then, again, quoting NATALIE will ask, but Stephen, how does the person get to a place of potential employment if he doesn't have transport money? How does he purchase clothes so that he can look suitable, so that someone like me who's interviewing him will actually give him a chance? And so all of this is coming from a position of how do we introduce this idea of dignity for people in our country? So something that boggles my mind is that a few years ago I read about someone in South Africa who had starved to death. Someone was living in the street and he starved to death. So in Cape Town specifically. So in Cape Town, we are often the murder capital of the country. We have neighborhoods where murder is a daily occurrence. We have car accidents. People seem to actually just look forward to rain falling in Cape Town so that they can drive into each other and cause accidents. But this man starved to death in the streets, which boggled my mind. If someone knocks on my door and asks for food, you're going to get a peanut butter sandwich and you're going to get an apple, if I have apples. I've always got peanut butter sandwiches, so my cooking is a peanut butter sandwich. You're always going to get a peanut butter sandwich. This man starved to death. So what do we do in our country to avoid the situation where people are literally starving to death in our streets? So the first proposal is about this idea of introducing a basic income grant. And this idea was around before COVID. So before COVID, there was really a lot of debate to say that we need a basic income grant to introduce this floor to look after people, so that we don't allow people just to starve to death in the streets, and that we actually are uplifting people to such an extent that they can go out and seek employment, that we're investing in our population. With COVID, when that came in and this 350 Rand per month was introduced, as Megan was speaking about, there was already a debate there about, well, do we make it means tested or not? What are the requirements if someone is going into employment? If someone is in education, should they be receiving this benefit? And how do we make it actually affordable from a national treasury perspective? So from a fiscus, what is affordable? And the debate is continuing still about what sort of basic income grant, this universal income grant, should we have in this country in terms of the level of benefit. So I go to the shop, I say to my wife, baby, I'm just going to go pick up something quickly to eat, and then suddenly I've spent 600 Rand in the blink of an eye. So 350 Rand, Megan spoke about the different definitions of poverty. What is going to be a suitable benefit? How is this Tier 1 grant, new Tier 1 grant, if it's formalized, going to form part of the overall Tier 1 grant system, and also then to make it universal, to make it means tested? That's part of the debate. And there's been a debate, as Megan was saying, for many years about whether means testing should be applied or not, but usually it's applied to the old age grant. So in South Africa, we've had the state old age grant from 1928 already. So we were the first country, first region in this part of the world to introduce this idea. It was introduced in the UK in 1908, And then in the 1920s, like I said, was introduced in South Africa. And obviously during these periods of racial discrimination, right up until 1993, there was a huge amount of discrimination in terms of the level of benefit that was paid out. But we've always had a means test applied since day one in 1928. And the first point that this slide is making is that there is a level of unfairness from a fiscal perspective because of the means test. So you've got roughly 2/3 of our population who are age 60 or older who are receiving the old age grant, i.e. the means test is applied to them and they still get the tick to say, yes, you do get an old age grant. We've got people who, if you're like me and every single month you check your pay slip to make sure that you haven't been shafted in terms of how much tax has been deducted. So I sat and calculated. So I've always known about the rebates. So we've got a primary rebate that is applied to everybody, but then from age 65 onwards, you've got the secondary rebate, and from age 75 onwards, you've got the tertiary rebate. So there's a cost to this from a SARS perspective in terms of there's additional reduction in income tax that's payable. And so people, a small group, 400,000 over the age of 60, is also benefiting from the fiscus. And then you've got this group of roughly 1 million individuals in the country that's receiving nothing. So what do we do for them? And so this is one argument as to why the means test should be removed in order to make the benefit universal, so that we remove that. There's other arguments also in terms of the means test effectively rewards bad behavior. It discourages people from saving. You haven't saved anything, let's give you a benefit. You have saved something, we're not going to give you a benefit. So we want to remove that. Also, the idea of actually enforcing this means test does imply that there's a cost involved, because SASSA is employing people to actually go and apply this means test. And from helping people, I can see that the SASSA employees on the ground seem to apply this means test in very different ways. Like if you go to the Bellville office versus the Cape Town office, there's a different system that's been applied, even though there's one means test. The problem is, of course, that money doesn't fall out of the sky, that there is a limit on what we can do. So even if we do use a clawback system to say, well, we're applying this benefit in a universal manner, but at the same time it's going to reduce your secondary and tertiary rebates, there's not enough money available in those rebates to actually cover the entire cost. And something that we should emphasize is that government, with the NHI debates, for example, there's already people there looking at these tax reductions saying, ooh, I can use it to subsidize this, I can use it to pay for that. The one that comes up then is the tax deductions that we receive as contributors to the retirement funds, which is also then going to be massively controversial. It's to say that, but listen, Stephen's getting a 350,000 Rand per annum contribution that's tax deductible. Maybe it shouldn't be 350,000 Rand, maybe it should be less. But that would give all of us grey hair that work in the industry. So on the one hand, we've got this idea, this vision of removing the means test, but there are constraints and there's delicate balancing act that has to be played here, including the fact that the state old age grant kicks in at the age of 60. I think we all remember about 15, 16 years ago when there was a challenge at the Constitutional Court because men were receiving it from age 65, and it had been that way all the way since 1928, and then that was reduced to age 60, as opposed to other countries like we saw France, people rioting and protesting because of the retirement age for social security benefits going up. We went the opposite direction. So now we've got this gap between 60 and 65, and also their Treasury, we've seen some interesting viewpoints about, do we have a simpler means test from 60 to 65, and then no means test from 65 onwards? But watch this space, we'll see what actually happens. I'm going to hand back to Andrea now for the Tier 2 proposals.
Thank you. I don't trust our counter at the bottom here looking at my watch, so I will move through it a bit more quickly to give you some time to end off at the end, Stephen. So just briefly in terms of Tier 2, in reality I think little has changed in the way that these benefits operate in practice, but there have been proposals, and specifically one that we should all be aware of, the National Social Security Fund, which is basically a mandatory national pension fund to which everyone would have to belong, with kind of top up in terms of voluntary schemes at the top. So even though I think in principle many people agree that something like this is needed, there has not been to date a lot of consensus in terms of how to go about doing this, what benefit structure would be appropriate, how it would be funded, who would contribute to it and at what level, the cost, and also who would be covered by it. So whilst NETALIE was still considering the proposals that were put forward by Interdepartmental Task Team, the Department of Social Development in 2021 issued another green paper to clarify the NSSF design. This was met with backlash because it didn't consider the NETLAC process and it was hastily withdrawn. So at the moment, we are currently waiting for another proposal in terms of NSSF, and to date, there has not been one published. In terms of the Road Accident Fund, many of you might be aware, especially recently, there has been some movement in this, in that from 2022, there has been a legal debate between Discovery and the Road Accident Fund in terms of the reimbursements of medical expenses associated with road accidents. Subsequently, there was the Road Accident Amendment Bill that was published, I think a month ago, open for comment, which closed last week. And there are significant changes being proposed in this bill. And I know it is being met with a lot of pushback from the legal fraternity for good reasons, and possibly also considering how much they benefit from the current Road Accident Fund scheme, but also with the medical aid, because in theory what they are proposing is that they do away with this compensation or reimbursement component of it, and that people will only qualify, road accident victims will only qualify for lower social benefits. So it's not compensation, but social benefits rather. And then people who belong to medical aids, and to the extent that your medical aid then covers some of the expenses associated with this accident, there will not be reimbursement. So medical aids cannot go and claim back against the Road Accident Fund for expenses incurred on motor vehicle accident, which obviously has a massive impact for reserving and the cost for members in medical schemes. So this is a significant piece of legislation which I know many of the players that are close to this have been involved in submitting comment on that bill. In terms of Tier 3 and Tier 4 reforms, I think these are the tiers that have seen the most change in recent years. And I also, one of my kind of pet peeves and what gets my blood boiling in this industry is when people say we have done little to nothing to improve the outcome for members in retirement funds, because it feels to me in the last decade we've done nothing but change the industry to make it work better for people and get them involved and pull people into the net. We've seen alignment of tax treatment of contributions. We've seen the default regulations come into play, compulsory annuitization, and we are all working tirelessly on the imminent two-part component legislation which will address that leakage thing. There are more changes on the cards in the form of benefit projections to members. We're waiting for a conduct standard on that. There has been some proposals regarding auto-enrollment, but clearly some work needs to be done there, because just this morning we realized between the three of us we each have a different understanding of what auto-enrollment would mean. There's also the paper on the governance on umbrella funds, which aims to kind of introduce and look and scrutinize, I think, the governance components of these funds to make sure that they are fit for purpose. So I think in these tiers specifically, we have seen reforms with more to come going into the future. So with all of this change and all of this happening, if we were to take a step back and had to consider, if we now had to rethink social security in South Africa, how do we move forward? Do we is it an evolution or a revolution type of debate? Meaning, do we use what's currently in the system and build on that and try and fix and make it fit for purpose, leverage off the successes, try and identify the failures and make the system more integrated so that it can talk better and provide better benefits to our society as a whole? Or do we kind of do away with all of that and come up with a brand new type of arrangement, which I think is in essence where the NSSF and potentially something like the NHI is looking towards? And, you know, I think everyone will have different views on this, but it does feel intuitively that there is merit in considering optimizing the current structure. Key grants can be universalized. We've got many informal savings vehicles in the form of stock files for people saving in the informal sector who are very much in favor of these vehicles and they work well for them. Insurance schemes, especially funeral schemes, are prevalent. They're everywhere. We have tax-free savings accounts, zero-fee bank accounts, and we do have that established Tier 3. And with all of the reforms happening in that sector specifically, there is this opportunity moving forward with alignment of all these funds and the ability to bring in some flexibility to potentially use them as a blueprint for our informal sector and bringing more people into the net to the extent that that net would work for them. So I think the question for us as actuaries is, how do we get involved? And I think that's where we'll end off our presentation with some of the work that we've been doing and how we see us moving forward in this space.
Thank you for hitting the fast forward button, because wow, that was fast. So what is the point of all of this? So what we find, and what we found going back to August 2021, is that there are individual actuaries who were involved at NEDLAC in terms of the debates and the negotiations, but we as the actuarial profession, we were at risk of becoming just witnesses to history. We weren't actually playing a role in the development of social security systems and the changes and reforms related to that. So we had to look at ourselves and say, well, how do we need to behave and how do we need to operate, how do we need to speak to decision makers in order to get our seat at the table? And so we put our heads together to say we need to change our approach. Instead of always trying to see ourselves as the smartest guy in the room, we actually need to become team players, hence all the rugby analogies, for example, to say that instead of just thinking that we're going to have the solution and you are going to listen to us and then accept our solution, we need to be humble and respectful enough to be part of a team, a multidisciplinary team, where we can give our input and then play a role in helping decision makers understand when you make a decision, these are going to be the expected consequences. So last year we had a debate. Hopefully everybody saw that debate. Lusani chaired the debate. It was looking at the more socialist version of social security reform versus the more capitalist version of social security reform. And we invited representatives from National Treasury and the Department of Social Development. And this was part of our reaching out to various government and non-government, so government departments and non-government organizations to give our input to be part of this discussion and this debate. So the representatives last year said they enjoyed the debate, but the thing that blew my mind was that we had a breakfast for them, and they were so excited to have the opportunity to speak to each other. So National Treasury and DSD employees speaking to each other, because they said there's no platform for them to talk to each other on a regular basis. So we said, come to our talks, and they sat there for 3 hours talking to each other, because as government departments, they just didn't have this platform. So I thought, okay, at least we achieved something. Subsequently, the public interest seminar that Lusani ran earlier this year, we participated in that, again speaking about different versions and visions for social security reform. But then we decided we're going to have these ongoing Indaba days. So we had our first event a couple of weeks ago, and we invited various organizations and government departments, and that again was very interesting, where we were able to then participate in this and to show how much we care. So we keep learning that people don't care how much we know until we show them how much we care. And it was a bit touchy feeling in the beginning, and Andrea gave me a clap over the head to say, you must be patient, you must wait, people must feel safe. And so I behaved myself, and I think we got there. It was exciting to get people's interaction. And certainly we're going to be having more of these events going forward. So these issues set out here, my time is almost up. These issues do need to be considered in terms of whatever decision is made when it comes to Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4, in terms of benefit design and contribution structure, etc., etc. So we feel that we have the experience and the knowledge to give serious technical input and guidance here, but we need to become involved so that people will actually listen to us. So if you're the smartest guy in the room, but you're a douchebag, no one's going to listen to you. It's that simple. So we're trying to be nice, we're trying to be friends to everybody, and we as the Actuarial Society continuously make ourselves available to speak. So when the Reserve Bank wanted to speak to actuaries about two-pots and implications for two-pots, we get volunteers. When the FSCA wants to speak to us, we get volunteers. So it's a call to action in terms of try to get involved wherever you can, and also try to think big picture, because something that we've learned over and over again is that in the private pensions industry, we're looking at actually a small subset of the overall population. So we need to think of what's the greater good. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. There I beat you to a Star Trek quote this time, Andrea. Usually she beats me. But that's the perspective we're trying to take. And we've got a whopping 2.5 minutes left, and we really are keen to hear input and questions. So thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone. Perhaps if we can just have one question. I know we're running a little bit over time. If there's any one question in the audience, or if everyone, there we have one.
Okay. Thank you so much for the presentation. Just have one question. Probably it's been asked many times. I just want to find out from you guys, like, what's the future of pension funds, especially from an actuarial perspective, because of the umbrella fund thing that's happening. Like, what does that mean for us especially as young people who are trying to qualify. I enjoy the pension fund space very much, but I'm skeptical because everybody is moving to insurance and all other stuff. But I enjoy it, but I'm afraid because of what's happening of umbrella funds.
Okay,
And
so
last
social
comment. I would love to meet Natalie. She sounds like somebody who has similar thinking as me, especially on
okay,
the social
so I'm going to
space.
take my social security working group hat off, and I'm going to put my RMC chairperson hat on. So in 1996, when I started studying at UCT, I was told, do not go into pensions. There's no future for actuaries in pensions. None. Okay. Recently, I volunteered to go and speak to a group of actuarial students, the fourth years from UCT, who are now considering what they're going to do. And then we had this speed dating arrangement. And when I got there, I was disappointed because I was only going to have 3 rounds, which means I only get to speak to 6 students. Only 4 students were prepared to speak to me as a pensions actuary, because the rest were like, we haven't got time for that loser, okay? Then when I speak to these guys and I tell them this is what I do on a daily basis, and I show them photos of myself and my wife when I go to speak at a pensions conference in Mauritius, and when I go to Namibia, and when I go to Zambia, and here's me at the Victoria Falls, etc., and how I get involved with occupational retirement funds, where you must be able to speak to people on the ground, like the workers, the trade union representatives, and you must be able to speak to the financial directors and the CEOs of companies. And I explain the developments that we're talking about here. And then the kids are like, oh, wow, that sounds awesome. Why was I told not to go into pensions? So I'm 46 years old, and one thing I know is I'm guaranteed employment for the rest of my life because we've got so few new people coming in. So at the pensions committee, when we have our annual seminar, I can answer everyone by name because I know everybody in the room, which is not a good thing. So if you want to keep me employed, that's great. Tell the kids don't come working pensions because it's an exciting opportunity for me to stay in employment and Andrea to stay in employment. And Megan can come back into the private sector because there's enough space for her. But wow, it boggles my mind when there's no resistance to me. Like, I can stay here for the rest of time. It's fine. I'm going to stay in employment. But there's tons of exciting opportunities. Pensions is the place to be. Amen.
If you do still have a burning question, please feel free to reach out to the speakers on the app via the connections function. I think most people are hungry for lunch. Just again, we'd like to apologize for the technical issues to those online experienced in our stream. It was recorded and it will be available in 24 hours. You will still receive your CPD points for watching the recording.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Megan. Do not tell Stephen there's no future in pensions. We're gonna have our lunch break now, and remember, there's a session at 12:25 brought to you by SA3 about the remuneration landscape in the actuarial industry, and that'll take place in Ballroom 1. So if you'd like to attend that, please pick up your lunch pack outside in the foyer, and then make your way to Ballroom 1. We'll be back here at 1:15. We hope to see you again. Thank you very much.